John Gilligan has been arrested in Spain. The convicted drug dealer was one of 6 people detained as part of an operation in the Alicante area, targeting a gang suspected of sending drugs and pills to the UK and Ireland by post.
The sort of operation he was at would be probably best described as cottage-level industry compared to what he had been in his heyday when he was earning millions.
They really flooded Ireland with cannabis. They hit the ground running.
John Gilligan has been arrested in Spain and a firearm seized that police there say is the same type as the gun used in the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin.
He immediately assaulted her.
That was certainly setting up some kind of reckoning.
He was so focused on being wronged, as he saw it, by this journalist who was relentlessly pursuing him.
Miss Guerin, Lord Mayor, she never wrote one word about me.
He let himself be led by his rage.
There was such a huge reaction to the shooting of Veronica Guerin that the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up and established within months of Veronica being killed.
I think it was innovative at the time, and I think it still is a shining light.
He tried every trick in the book to try and thwart CAB and to try and keep them away from him.
If we're after you and we're putting our file together, we'll do our inquiries. It doesn't matter how long it takes.
Spain again became his kind of bolt hole.
It's a very different environment in Spain, the prison system. Nobody in Spain knows who this pint-sized Irish old man is, so that could be challenging.
John Gilligan is one of Ireland's most notorious crime lords. He rose to prominence in the early 90s and his gang was behind the murder of journalist Veronica Guerin. With his recent arrest in Spain, it seems Gilligan's career has come full circle and he now finds himself operating a much smaller criminal enterprise. Not a far cry from how he began his life of crime.
John Gilligan, or Little John as he was known, grew up in Ballyfermot in Dublin, and at the age of 12 he left school and started out on his life of crime. He started robbing people. He was very into making money even at that early stage, and at the age of 14 he joined his dad on a ferry line, and at that stage apparently he got involved in a corruption racket with his dad on the ferry line, and they were stealing fares. It was in 1978 that he started out as Factory John.
They carried out, a huge number of break-ins at commercial properties targeting high-value goods like video recorders and television sets, and had stole as much as £1 million worth of goods.
When the Factory gang were in the height of their success, they were carrying out at least one major heist a week, and John Gilligan would carry around a pistol with him. They became known as the hole-in-the-wall gang because they would use sledgehammers sometimes to make holes or break holes in factory walls in order to get in there. He would also be able to thwart the security systems. He had truck drivers and security employees on his payroll.
Yeah, from his very early days involved in criminality, he kind of proved he wasn't afraid to use threats of violence, in particular against people, so that they wouldn't give evidence or talk to Gardaí about him. And this obviously became a major tenet of his personality, and he followed this through all the way until the murder of Veronica Guerin.
He was very Machiavellian. He didn't care how he was going to achieve that wealth. He didn't care who he hurt on the way. He would even intimidate witnesses if there were trials coming up. He would intimidate jurors in order to stop trials, and a lot of the prosecutions didn't go ahead because of this.
He was behind a break-in of a large hardware store, kind of a builder-supplier type business in Enniscorthy in 1987, and the stolen goods were hidden in a yard in Ballymount. And at the time the guards had a good idea who they were after, but they didn't catch him in the act. But they actually got him then when he was actually moving the stolen goods from the Ballymount yard, and they were finally able to kind of make some charges stick.
In 1990, he was jailed for 4 years. He was in the Portlaoise maximum security prison, so he really had time to think. At that time, a lot of notorious criminals were in Portlaoise. A number of Martin Cahill's gang, Brian Meehan was in there at the time, Paul Ward was in there. He became very close to Paul Ward and Brian Meehan, and they saw him as their new godfather at the time. So he made a lot of connections. He focused his mind. He decided that at that stage he wanted to embark on a career as a drug baron.
John Gilligan, he's about 14 feet, he's gone down to 5'6".
Prison for John Gilligan, like many criminals of that era, it was their education, much the way some people go to college, to university for 4 years to study. He went to prison for 4 years and learned the tricks of the trade and met other criminals. They would swap information about how to develop drugs networks and how to become more advanced criminals and better criminals, essentially.
And when he was released in 1993, he decided that was it. He was never going back to prison again, that it was for mugs, that it was a major disruption to his quest to gain huge amounts of wealth. And so he embarked on his drug empire, and he would utilise the contacts that he made in Portlaoise prison in order to do that.
He had begun to make some inroads into the drugs game, and he developed a contact in Amsterdam, a Lebanese man who was going to be able to facilitate moving a large shipment of cannabis to Dublin via Cork. So he was putting his toe in the water, so to speak, but when he got out of prison, he was flat broke, he'd no money. But he realised that drugs was the way to go and forget about these Mickey Mouse heists.
John Traynor, or the coach as he was known, he would have seen himself as a respectable businessman, but he was a con man. He had served time in prison. He knew Gilligan from his time also on the ferry line. He would have been involved in that corruption racket with Gilligan. So he was somebody who knew John Gilligan from an early age. And when John Gilligan left Portlaoise and Cork prison in 1993 and decided he wanted to embark on a drug empire, that he wanted to be a serious player, that he wanted to be a drug baron, he and John Traynor sat down and talked about it. They discussed what type of drugs they were going to import and sell. They looked at heroin, but John Traynor advised him that the courts were too hard on heroin dealers, and even the provost came down hard on those who were dealing heroin. They decided that cannabis would be the less controversial drug.
Traynor recommended they speak to another man by the name of Martin Cahill, known as the General. And Martin Cahill was very eager to get involved in the financing of drug shipments because he was a very wealthy man. And this suited Gilligan and his emerging gang perfectly at the time because they'd no money, but they knew how to do it. And he was promised he would get this back threefold from the Gilligan gang. Now, he never actually did because he was murdered before he could be paid back in full.
Gardaí investigating his murder believe this was a professional gangland assassination.
With the death of the General and their debts essentially wiped out, the Gilligan gang saw their profits skyrocket.
They really flooded Ireland with cannabis. They hit the ground running in terms of setting up drug networks, importation, particularly from the Netherlands. And they amassed a huge amount of money. I think it's estimated around 20 million altogether.
There was one occasion when Fatso Mitchell was pulled in by the guards, and when he's been interviewed, he complained that there was reports that he was making 60,000 a week, and he said it was nothing like that. It was only 30,000 a week. I mean, the younger members of the gang were getting known about town. They were hanging out in the trendy nightclubs, doing cocaine, dressing in designer clothes. They weren't shy about advertising how wealthy they were becoming, and they were pretty cocky. They were fairly sure that they were untouchable at that stage.
And while Gilligan's gang were not unique in their blatant displays of wealth, it brought them to the attention of one of the country's leading crime correspondents, Veronica Guerin.
Well, Veronica Guerin came to journalism quite late in life. She had trained and worked as an accountant. She also worked in PR, and for the last 6 or 7 years of her life, she worked as an investigative journalist. She certainly made her mark. She was known to be very tenacious and determined.
Within 2 years, she had become the best known crime reporter in the country. She was drawing attention to the gangs, to the amount of drug dealing that was going on. I don't think Veronica nor the guards at the time had any idea just how much money they were making, but she certainly drew attention to their activities and to the complete ineffectiveness of the legislation at the time and how hard it was for the guards to get a handle on these guys.
She used her know-how, actually, her accountancy background. She used that to her advantage to be able to follow the money in a very effective way.
Central to her work was a network of confidential informants. One of her more frequent sources was close Gilligan associate, John Traynor.
The relationship between John Traynor and Veronica Guerin no doubt was complex. Traynor was used to playing both sides. Sometimes he would supply good information, sometimes he'd serve completely bogus information designed to have people look the wrong way.
The man who spoke out of both sides of his mouth, he couldn't be trusted. Gardaí didn't trust him. Ultimately, Veronica couldn't trust him. Any journalist who dealt with him couldn't trust him.
In 1995, Veronica Guerin was on her way out to a staff party actually in the Sunday Independent. Her husband and her son were out of the house at the time. She heard a knock at the door. She opened the door and there was a gunman wearing a motorcycle helmet. He pointed the gun at her head and then pointed it down at her leg, and he shot her in the thigh. She spoke openly about this. There were a number of suspects that the Gardaí were looking into in the criminal world, people that she may have been investigating, but it's understood that Veronica Guerin herself, towards the end of her life, suspected that it was John Traynor that ordered this hit, because he wanted criminals that he would have been connected to believe that he wasn't friendly with her, that he wasn't her source.
Through her contact, John Traynor, Veronica Guerin knew that John Gilligan was building a substantial criminal enterprise. So she decided to come here to Jessbrook, where she hoped to interview him. She spoke with Gilligan at the door, but he quickly became nasty and he began to assault her. During the attack, he threatened to kill both her husband and her son. Veronica made her escape, but that day her fate was sealed. And 9 months later, the Gilligan gang would murder Veronica Guerin.
This would have been something Veronica would have often employed. This tactic was to go directly to the person she intended to write a story about and ask them to talk to her, because oftentimes it was fruitful for her. She had done it with Jerry the Monk Hutch and he had subsequently given her interviews. So this was her approach, to go directly to the person and say, I believe this is what you're doing. What do you have to say about it? In this instance, it provoked an extremely angry reaction from John Gilligan.
She claimed that he immediately assaulted her, that he started punching her in the side of the head and face with his fists, that she eventually got back to her car and she collapsed on the ground, and he wasn't finished there. He dragged her and violently placed her back in the car, and she claimed that he then ripped her shirt because he was looking for a wire, until she eventually managed to get away and she drove off.
Veronica Guerin, she needed medical treatment, and she obviously thought about her next step, but she went ahead and decided to press charges against Gilligan. Now, for Gilligan, when he was charged, he couldn't countenance the idea of being jailed again for even 6 months, which a man of his record, he would have been looking at that kind of sentence. For him at that stage, as we know now, would have cost millions, and he wasn't prepared to lose that kind of money. So that was certainly setting up some kind of reckoning.
Veronica wasn't going to let it go. It was a savage beating. Unfortunately, the type of person John Gilligan was, neither was he. And as far as he was concerned, that was her warning. He told her to back off. He told her not to put any articles about him in the Sunday Independent. And the result, I suppose, was a standoff between the two of them. But I suppose nobody at that stage could have anticipated just the vitriol Gilligan had for her, and for anyone trying to expose him in the newspapers and put him out of business and put him back in jail.
Gilligan's cannabis business was booming, and the threat of a prison sentence over the assault of Veronica Guerin was something he wasn't prepared to accept. He sees an opportunity to stop the case from proceeding when John Traynor hands over information about the reporter's movements.
Veronica Guerin had an inkling that John Traynor, the coach, was behind that shooting in 1995 when she was shot in the thigh. So she was very wary of him. She described him as being dangerous and very two-faced, but she continued to treat him as a source. But she was threatening to expose him, and she wanted more information on John Gilligan. And during one of their last meetings, she was talking to John Traynor, and she let it slip that she was due to appear at Naas District Court, and that would have been the 26th of June.
And this information was passed on from Traynor to the Gilligan gang. This was something that Traynor later denied, but Gardaí said in court, and have no doubt, that it was John Traynor who passed that information on to the Gilligan gang, and Traynor was well aware that John Gilligan wanted information about Veronica Guerin's movements because he had sworn revenge against her, essentially.
So all of a sudden they had a time, date and place where she was going to be, and obviously that accelerated the plans in the minds of the gang that now was their chance and they could do something about Veronica Guerin once and for all.
While the road layout has changed here, this is the spot where Veronica Guerin was murdered. She'd attended court that day in Naas, where she had been up on a speeding charge, but she'd got a small fine and was happy with the result. She pulled up to a red light and picked up her phone and made a call. With that, a motorbike pulled up alongside her car and a gunman opened fire. It's understood that Veronica died instantly. The murder sparked a massive public outcry, and the resulting investigation was extensive and innovative.
John Gilligan definitely felt like he was untouchable. He was also hugely naive. Himself and his gang members believed they could murder Veronica Guerin, and within a few weeks it would have blown over. They expected a bit of heat. They didn't anticipate at all the massive public outcry, both from government, Gardaí, and of course the general public. And that was a terribly naive move, and Gilligan was just so focused on revenge. He was so focused on being wronged, as he saw it, by this journalist who kind of was relentlessly pursuing him. So he had blinkers, and he let himself be led by his rage.
It was a massive investigation. There were 100 officers working on the case, 30 investigators. They analysed every criminal that Veronica Guerin had written about, that she had spoken to or interviewed during her time as an investigative journalist. But all the information led back to Gilligan and his gang.
The murder investigation was headed up by Chief Superintendent Tony Hickey, and he brought an incisive level of control and focus to it. He'd studied in Quantico with the FBI and with Scotland Yard and knew how to carry out a major investigation of this nature. It was the first time that they used mobile phone tracking to piece together members of the gang to find out who was talking to who, when they were talking. They looked at all the mobile phone traffic on the day of the murder. It was crucial in identifying Russell Warren, who they didn't know. He wasn't known to the guards, and Charles Bowden as well. Neither of these guys had come up on the Garda radar before, and it's quite unlikely any of their underworld informants would have known about them either.
Charlie Bowden, he was a former soldier. He was an expert in guns as a result. He was very interested in guns. He had fallen on hard times. He owed a lot of child support to his first wife. So it's for this reason, kind of out of necessity, he got involved in criminality rather than being brought up as a criminal.
Russell Warren was also part of the gang. He was called the bag man. He was the financial controller, so to speak. So he had a very important job, but he really wasn't respected by John Gilligan. He would have been seen as a weak link.
Neither Bowden nor Warren were hardened criminals in that they'd never served a day in jail. They were very much brought in as backup.
Bowden and Warren are brought in for questioning, and over a number of days they reveal the extent of Gilligan's drug operation and the plot to kill Veronica Guerin.
Well, Russell Warren said that he met Brian Meehan on the morning of the 26th of June 1996, that he handed over the bike to Brian Meehan, that Meehan directed him to go to Naas to look out for a red Opel Calibra car, which was Veronica Guerin's car, because she was due in Naas District Court that day to answer a speeding fine. He said that when he went there, he eventually saw her leaving the court. He said he was in contact by mobile phone with John Gilligan and Brian Meehan all the while. He got into his car, and he said he was about 4 cars behind her as she made her way back to Dublin on the Naas Road. He said he then saw Brian Meehan on the motorbike. He was driving the motorbike with the hitman as a pillion passenger.
Charlie Bowden cleaned the gun, put the bullets in it and gave it to Dutchy Holland. And it was his evidence to the court that Dutchy Holland was the gunman who murdered Veronica Guerin on that day. Dutchy Holland died in prison in 2009 in the UK. He was serving a sentence for a plot to kidnap a businessman. He had denied the murder, but it was the belief of Gardaí and their evidence as well that he was indeed the triggerman.
Across the country, criminal gangs had become more violent and more brazen in their attacks. A new tool was needed to fight organised crime. And after the murder of Veronica Guerin, public outrage and political will was there in order to fast-track the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau. The Bureau was an arm of law enforcement with just one goal: to follow the money.
The death of Veronica Guerin touched so many people in a way that they never thought would be possible, and to see somebody who was doing their job, who was reporting on this type of crime, killed in such a way, it spurred people on to want to do something, to want to really get at the very heart of why these people are doing what they're doing.
Within a week of her murder, legislation had been introduced into Dáil, and in fact it was introduced by opposition justice spokesperson John O'Donoghue, seeking to deal with the illicit gains that gangland criminals were making. And as a result of that, all parties in the Dáil enacted the Proceeds of Crime Act. And that was a huge change to how we deal with organised crime in this country.
The Criminal Assets Bureau was very innovative. We hadn't seen anything like that in Ireland before, and it was obviously necessary because, you know, there was laws there to try and tackle criminals in relation to crimes they had committed, and, you know, the burden of proof was on the Gardaí, as always is the case in these crimes, to try and prove whether a person had committed a crime or not. But there was never anything in the background to focus on how a person was amassing a huge amount of wealth with no obvious means of earning that money.
So it was a key moment that the onus of proof switched from the guards to the criminal.
And John Gilligan was the first cab target who would have to explain how he was able to finance a multi-million euro development in County Kildare.
If you look back at Gilligan and how he accumulated his wealth and what he did with it, we can see that in 1987, he and Geraldine bought a very small little house out in a townland called Mucklawn near Enfield in County Kildare. This little house that he bought in Mucklawn was the beginning of the empire that would end up as a massive equestrian centre.
Jessbrook, I suppose, was really John Gilligan's vanity project, and it was him showing off to the world how much money he had. It was really his wife, Geraldine, who had the interest in horses much more so than John. He did to an extent, but it was really her world, and she kind of got him involved in it. And then there was such a huge amount of money there that they decided to develop this equestrian centre.
While the Criminal Assets Bureau was proving to be a very significant thorn in Gilligan's side, he had bigger problems.
In the meantime, John Gilligan's gang continued to import drugs right up until October of 1996, but it became more and more difficult for them because they had less money at their disposal, because their assets were being frozen very quickly as CAB was moving in on them. And in October 1996, John Gilligan was approached by officers at Heathrow Airport, and he had £300,000 in his possession.
He was charged in connection with money laundering, and he was held in Belmarsh high security. And he was there until the Irish authorities charged him with the murder of Veronica Guerin. They successfully made the argument in court that the charges in Ireland were more serious and that they therefore should go ahead in Ireland first before his money laundering charges in the UK.
Gilligan fights the extradition for 3 years, but in 2001 he returns to Ireland to stand trial before the Special Criminal Court for the murder of Veronica Guerin.
Following the money laundering charges that were brought against him in the UK, he faced extradition proceedings, but he challenged them for a number of years. But eventually, in February 2000, he was extradited back to Dublin to face a charge of murdering Veronica Guerin and drug trafficking charges. When he was brought back on the plane, he was still in his prison overalls, those yellow and green prison overalls. And when he arrived at the airport, he was furious to see that there were over 20 photographers there to take photographs of him. He was eventually brought to the Special Criminal Court. Apparently he smirked at reporters when he was there. He had insisted that he wanted to change his clothing before he appeared in the dock there, and the charges were put to him.
Gilligan probably would still have been confident that he was going to be able to avoid being convicted again. There was, at the time, there was 4 main witnesses. These included both Russell Warren and Charles Bowden, but they also included an ex-girlfriend of Gilligan's at the time and one of his Dutch contacts. Now, as it would turn out, 2 of those would be intimidated and felt threatened enough, and they never came to Ireland to actually to give their evidence in court. And in the end, the prosecution had to rely heavily on Bowden and Warren. They basically started the witness protection program for those 2 men. There was incredible scenes in you know, in the forecourts down the quays in Dublin at the time. There were snipers on the roof, there was helicopters overhead, there was heavily armed police and guards.
At the end of the trial, during the verdict, Mr. Justice Diarmuid O'Donovan said that he was going to treat the evidence of Russell Warren as uncorroborated and unreliable. He said that he had grave suspicions that John Gilligan was involved in ordering and in organising the murder of Veronica Guerin. John Gilligan thought he wasn't going to get much for the drug trafficking charges in terms of a sentence, and he said he was going to be out of there.
Certainly Gardaí were massively disappointed. It was a real blow, they felt, for him not to be convicted of Veronica Guerin's murder. They took some solace in the fact that he was handed down a 28-year sentence for drug trafficking. This was the longest ever sentence in the history of Ireland in relation to a drugs crime. So they did take some solace in that. That was reduced to 20 years on appeal, but it was still an extremely lengthy sentence.
Despite insisting he'd never return to prison, Gilligan found himself back in Portlaoise, serving a very long sentence. But behind bars and in the company of some of Ireland's most notorious criminals, he continued to run his drug empire.
During his prison term, that 17-year prison term, Gardaí believed that Gilligan was still trying to operate his drugs empire.
Portlaoise prison is a very different regime to the rest of the Irish prison system. It's a much more relaxed environment. They have a lot more privileges and freedom. So he made a lot more contacts again, particularly with some Limerick criminals, the McCarthy Dundons. He became quite close to them in particular. There was even pictures of emerging at one point of him kind of living the high life and partying with some very well-known criminals, including John Daly. So he continued to be a very well-known figure, and he was infamous really because of his involvement in the Guerin murder.
When the prison gate opened at 9:35, this was the first time Gilligan was seen in public without handcuffs and being chained to a prison officer in almost 17 years. True to form, he appeared to lap up the attention from the awaiting media before getting into a waiting car.
John Gilligan is now a free man, but his time behind bars, where he continued to challenge his detention over and over, is estimated to have cost the taxpayer close to €15 million in legal fees. Where he goes from here will no doubt be monitored closely by the media, but detectives who've been a thorn in his side for years will also be hot on his tail, watching his every move.
Following his release in October 2013, his brother had a party for him in Clondalkin.
We knocked on his door, a couple of journalists, and he had just arrived back to his brother's house and the party was just about to get underway. And we just asked him what he had to say about his release, about Veronica Guerin, about this infamous crime he was accused of.
You accept you?
No, I didn't.
Accepted?
No, I didn't. And I didn't. And I see people said I admitted this. I didn't know such thing. And another thing is, one of the reasons why I didn't get convicted of special criminal court of the murder, when people said I threatened the lady in an office, we asked, at them days, there was no throwaway forms them days, they were all forms, bill forms to your landline. And the court said for 5 days they asked prosecutors, please produce a bill form here and we'll know where these threats came from, if he was a Roman, if he was in Ireland, or if he was in another jurisdiction. And the prosecutors didn't produce any because there was none, because I never made any phone call.
Now a free man, John Gilligan fully expects to pick up where he left off. But the criminal underworld has moved on, and Gilligan finds he's no longer welcome.
When John Gilligan was at his criminal height, I suppose if you want to call it that, in the early and mid 1990s, he was trading in drugs. He had built up a huge reputation as a successful criminal within the ranks of the criminal underworld. He knew a lot of criminals, they would have mixed together, there would have been a lot of collaboration. But after he was released from prison, it was a different landscape he came out to.
He was coming back from a christening. He stopped off at his brother's house in Clondalkin. He had been dropped there by his daughter Tracy. When he was in the house, 2 armed men came into the house and he ran into the toilet and they fired a number of shots, hitting him in the chest, in the face and in the hip. So he had to undergo surgery that night and he was given the last rites also.
Even though it had been 17 years, I think the criminal underworld was still very unhappy that basically, because of John Gilligan's, as they saw, reckless actions of murdering a journalist, that they were all still paying the price because CAB was after them every day and every night. They felt when John Gilligan then came out and started immediately trying to throw his weight around, that he didn't know his place and that he should be apologising and he should be remorseful and he shouldn't be making demands of getting back involved in criminality.
It's believed that Gilligan cut a deal with Ireland's top gangland figures to spare his life. But cut off from the drug trade and unable to earn, Gilligan redoubles his efforts to hold on to the few assets he has left.
He tried every trick in the book to try and thwart CAB and to try and keep them away from him. He tried all sorts of legal avenues. He appealed points of law, he appealed the legislation that brought about the Criminal Assets Bureau. He appealed everything. He changed his lawyers, and he was able to do this because he had free legal aid. We paid for all of that, and he persisted and persisted and persisted for more than 21 years to try and stop CAB taking the last of his properties from him.
No matter who the first person was going to be, they were always going to challenge it. But I suppose it was an indication that John Gilligan was the central focus of CAB in its early days, that he was the person who challenged it. But the legislators at the time in Dáil Éireann recognised that this was a piece of legislation that would be challenged in the courts, and they deserve to be commended for drafting the legislation in such a way that it didn't overstep the constitutional mark.
The Criminal Assets Bureau first initiated proceedings against John Gilligan and his family in 1996, and in 1997 the High Court granted a Section 3 proceeds of crime application to the Criminal Assets Bureau in relation to that. But then after there followed a multitude of applications and motions by the Gilligan family, and subsequently it was 2017 before the Criminal Assets Bureau was in a position to dispose of the last of the Gilligan family assets. So all the different appeals, all the different motions that they went through, and of course, obviously, we contested them, they appealed them, so proceeded for that length of time. You're looking at basically over 21 years of actions in relation to that.
In 2017, John Gilligan made one final appearance in an Irish court to appeal the decision against the seizure of his assets, which he claimed were not the proceeds of crime. After 21 years of legal challenges, all paid for by the Irish taxpayer, it was up to the Supreme Court to make the final decision.
Before that case, as he was walking into the court that morning, and I was well used to trotting along beside John Gilligan with a microphone in hand, trying to get him to comment on anything he might want to comment on, and he would always just look straight ahead with this kind of a smug grin on his face and keep walking and never say a word. And then, just as he got to the door, he said to me, 21 years I've been waiting for this. And I was like, okay, so he's talking now. So we chatted for a while, and it was bizarre because he just kept on going over old court cases and dates and times and where he felt that the cases against him were wrong and how he had been wronged, and this would be his day where he would finally win. And then out of the blue, I didn't prompt it, out of the blue he started talking about Veronica Guerin without prompting at all. And he said to me, I pray for Veronica, which is a hard thing to hear from a man who was the head of the gang that killed her. John Gilligan arrived in with the son and sits at the back of the court, and Geraldine was sitting up behind me with Tracy. And Gilligan was smiling, and he was thumbs up to Tracy and big smile on his face. And I found out afterwards that word had actually got out into the media that Gilligan had won his case. Erroneously, this word got out. So when the panel of judges came in and John Gilligan stood up, he was full sure he had won his case, and he was just waiting for it to be confirmed. So when the judges then said, the case fails, you've lost, his jaw hit the floor, and you could see it on the faces of all the CAB staff that were there, their elation that finally they had got what they wanted. But the way that John's face changed was incredible.
The Equestrian Centre at Jessbrook, that was taken over in the early 2000s, but the house where Geraldine lived, it wasn't until 2017 that they finally got the legal orders that she was forced to hand it over. Gilligan was seen back in the house at that time and they stripped it bare. They took the fencing, they took electrical fittings, and Gilligan even went on the social housing list claiming he was homeless.
With no Irish assets remaining and a clear message from Gangland that he's no longer welcome, a desperate Gilligan heads abroad.
He would have spent time abroad. Spain again became his kind of bolt hole, trying to get things going again.
He was trying to board a plane from Belfast over to Spain, and he had, I think it was just under 20,000 euro, I think it was around 17,000 sterling in cash. And there was a piece of cardboard with the name of a prescription drug written on it, a drug known as Zimmos.
The detectives involved thought that this money was going to be brought to Spain to buy prescription drugs for illegal resale back in Ireland. Of course, as we found out then earlier this year, that's exactly what he was up to.
Irish assets and a clear message from Gangland to stay out of the drug trade, cash-strapped Gilligan began to sell assets he had hidden in Spain, including a pub called the Judge's Chambers. In 2015, I travelled to Spain, posing as a potential buyer.
I have the bar outside also. This has electric and barbecue inside. Well, it's a beautiful bar.
You own the bar?
It's my bar, yeah.
John Gilligan's daughter, Tracy, claims she's the owner of the bar. We offer her cash and an opportunity to keep the deal off the books.
That's not a problem. The black money. The price is 450,000. This is the least. This is the price. The mortgage at the moment is for 250,000 euros. So this
that place.
So this is the minimum for the deeds.
Right. Right.
And then the balance of the money is possible black money.
The Gilligan family is no longer associated with the pub, but John Gilligan found it difficult to quietly liquidate his Spanish assets. And in 2018, he went back to his old ways.
In terms of criminality, Gilligan had gone off the radar. Apart from his cab appearances, in court, still wrestling over Jessbrook. I mean, that was about it. It wasn't until, I think in 2018, he was arrested again with a bag of money, this time in Belfast Airport. And he had a piece of paper with a Zopiclone written on it. Detectives involved thought that this money was going to be brought to Spain to buy prescription drugs for illegal resale back in Ireland. He spent 5 months on remand at the time. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. But of course, as we found out then earlier this year, that's exactly what he was up to. He was buying Zopiclone and shipping it back on a kind of a mail order business.
On the 25th of October this year, the Spanish National Police announced that they had arrested John Gilligan at a villa in Alicante.
The Spanish police had been watching Gilligan at the villa in Los Balcones. The sort of operation he was at would be probably best described as cottage level industry compared to what he had been in his heyday when he was earning millions. He was certainly in the premiership of European drug dealing.
He used a very unsophisticated, very basic method of basically sending drugs, primarily cannabis and a lot of pills as well, a lot of prescription pills. But he was doing it through the post, through the regular post and also through couriers. And this was seen as a very, very basic way to get drugs from A to B. It certainly wasn't the John Gilligan, of the 1990s who, was arranging these massive shipments. It was small parcels of drugs.
And very significantly, they showed footage of the police searching a garden. You can see in the footage that they found a handgun.
Spanish authorities initially believed this weapon could be the same gun used to kill Veronica Guerin, but that was quickly proven to be untrue. Regardless, it's a significant find, and if found guilty, will have a huge impact on the length of Gilligan's sentence.
Gilligan hasn't really given an explanation, I suppose, as to why there was a gun buried at his property. It'll be up to the Spanish police now to try and link this gun to him and to try and get a charge on him in relation to this gun. I'm sure it'll be within his powers to deny all knowledge of the gun, but if they can link it forensically to him, he has questions to answer there.
And while we wait for those questions to be answered, John Gilligan languishes in a Spanish prison, a far cry from the party atmosphere he enjoyed in Portlaoise. I caught up with Gerard Cousins, an English journalist based in Spain, to find out more about the conditions in the prison where Gilligan is being held.
He's almost certainly going to be in Funkalent prison. It's an old prison. It's a very overcrowded prison, one of the most overcrowded prisons in Spain. It was built for 450 inmates, and I think it's currently got about 800 inmates there. It was also the prison where, interestingly, Spain's first prison worker died of coronavirus earlier this year in March. What's happening now is there's an ongoing judicial investigation led by an investigating judge, which is all done behind closed doors, into Gilligan and the 5 other people that were arrested with him, including his girlfriend, but were then subsequently released on bail. Gilligan's the only one who's been remanded in custody. But it won't be before next year. I'm sure that we'll at least next year before we know whether Gilligan's going to be charged. But the evidence seems to be good against him.
What the criminal case is, as of yet, we don't know, but it's a major blow for Gilligan to face another lengthy stretch behind bars at his age as well. And it's a very different environment in Spain, the prison system, to what he would be used to in Portlaoise, where he was John Gilligan. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody, he felt, was impressed by who he was, or should be impressed by who he was. Nobody in Spain knows who this kind of pint-sized Irish old man is, you know. So that could be challenging for him.
There are uncertain times ahead for John Gilligan, but with a strong case being built against him and a long history of criminality, this could be the end of the line for one of Ireland's most notorious criminals. But his crimes and his lengthy legal battles with Gardaí and the Criminal Assets Bureau have had a lasting impact on Irish society.
When we see the recent arrest of John Gilligan in Spain, what it teaches us is that a person may be arrested, may be convicted, may serve a very lengthy time in prison, but sometimes people will revert to criminal activity. And I think the important thing from CAB's point of view is that even though they've been successful with a person previously, I know that CAB will not lose interest in that person simply because they've served a sentence and have been released from prison. If you make the foolish decision to get back involved in criminal activity again, you can be sure that the Criminal Assets Bureau will be keeping a close eye upon you.
And one of the effect that Gilligan's oppositional behaviour to authorities had was that he effectively bulletproofed the legislation for the next generation.
Not only was he the cause of CAB being set up, but he also tested it to the limits legally. And now CAB are in a position where if anybody appeals anything, there's points of law and there's precedents set because of John Gilligan's challenges, which can be wiped away, and CAB can now move forward quite quickly through procedures.
The organised crime group led by John Gilligan, it led to the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and it's here forevermore for the community, for the citizens of Ireland, but also it's held up as a gold standard for other agencies globally when they want to establish a similar bureau or unit. They come to us and they reach out to us to see how do we work, what's the training involved, you know, what are the partnerships, how are the team rooms made up. So it's 25 years later, I suppose we are still working for the people of Ireland, but also reaching out globally to our other law enforcement partners.
So ironically, John Gilligan gifted something very special to the people of Ireland.
You could say that, yes.
The fact that this has disabled and I think disarmed so many of these gangs and done so in a very public way, I think has been a very good thing, and I think it sends a very clear message that we won't tolerate this kind of behaviour, that we won't tolerate this type of activity taking hold of our communities, and where innocent people are really caught in the crossfire.